St. Petersburg 1900 is a very vibrant cosmopolitan place. Orthodox members of the aristocracy are beginning to flirt with ideas of theosophy, with Ouija boards and seances. Rumours begin to circulate in the early 1900s of this guy Rasputin, who has curious healing powers.
In 1903, Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg with an appearance far from regal. He was a shaggy figure, with a sable coat thrown over peasant boots and a blouse.
He smelt a bit like a goat, apparently. He had long, rather greasy black hair, a thick black beard, which people said was covered in last week's dinner.
He parted his hair in the middle and combed it kind of over his forehead, because apparently he had a bump on his forehead he wanted to hide. Other people would say it was like a horn he was trying to hide when they want to compare him with the devil. He was pretty repulsive looking.
Even his eyes held no warm religious feeling and were often described as the eyes of a maniac. In the first few years of the 20th century, Russia was suffering massive domestic disorder, as well as the constant threat of foreign invasion. The rich sought amusement, and the church needed a boost.
So the church was looking for genuinely spiritual types from the common people. And likewise, the monarchy was similarly looking for people like Rasputin who could give it some sort of divine authority.
His reputation as a preacher had preceded him, and he had an entree into high circles within the church, and from there into the aristocracy and the royal family.
Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra lived a life of opulence and luxury, in extraordinary palaces, furnished with gold, and anything their hearts desired. The one dark cloud was that the heir to the throne, Alexei, suffered from haemophilia, an agonizing blood disorder thought incurable.
The Empress was desperate for someone to heal her son, the Tsarevich Alexis, because she had brought haemophilia into the Romanov family through her own family of Hesse. She saw her son's illness, the first male heir to be born, as a punishment from God.
In November 1906, Rasputin was summoned to the royal palace at Tsarskoye Selo to see if his mystical ability to heal could help.
It seems that he was able to stop the bleeding of the Tsarevich on occasion, whether this was by hypnotism or by simply his presence, which seemed to have a calming effect, or whether it was because he comforted the mother, who was hysterical.
With the illness of Alexei becoming progressively worse, the Empress was convinced that only a miracle could save her son.
An incident in 1912 really sort of fixed his position there. The Empress was out riding with Alexis, and he had some sort of fall, and the internal bleeding began. In her desperation, the Empress telegrams Rasputin, who's at home in his village in western Siberia.
And by return, he sends a telegram back saying, "God has heard your prayers and seen your tears. The little one will not die. Tell the doctors not to bother him too much." Miracle of miracles, the next morning he recovers, the bleeding stops. That sealed it for Alexandra. A miracle had occurred.
And from that point on, Rasputin's comings and goings at the court became more frequent.
This finally secured Rasputin's position in the royal palace and his place in Russian history forever. With his position in the palace secure and the assurance of the Empress's protection, Rasputin set about abusing every rule in the holy book.
He was a dual character if ever there was one. He could go straight from the Tsarevich's bedside, where he was praying fervently for his recovery, to the brothel down the road. He would boast about his mystical powers as much about his powers as a lover. So, in a sense, you know, his two careers were going apart in parallel.
It's like a pop star suddenly being a star overnight and don't know what to do with their money or their fame, and and their power, in a sense. And he had this wonderful power.
So from about 1912, he's a frequent fixture in the private apartments of the Empress, where he acts, in a sense, as her confidant, her confessor. She obviously took great comfort in his presence, not least because of his calming influence on the boy.
Rasputin was well aware that as long as the prince was alive, he had run of the royal house. The Empress's trust was paramount to Rasputin's quest for fame and power.
Those who were in government positions didn't want the Empress to hear that they were fighting Rasputin. Anybody who didn't like Rasputin lost their job.
The seats of government were filling up with fortune hunters and incompetents, many of whom were happy to pay large amounts to Rasputin for the position.
The best way to describe him is as a fixer. He had acquired so much influence at court that he could really almost do anything. He could make a bishop. He could unmake a bishop. He could ensure that somebody was advanced in a ministry. He even made prime ministers and unmade them.
Russia's last chance at honest government was the Prime Minister Peter Stolypin, who was compiling a file of evidence against Rasputin.
He had to prove to the Tsar and Tsarina that this man was evil. He collected this huge file of all these scandals that was going on. The file proved that Rasputin was debauched, that he could make Mama, who was Tsarina, and Papa, the Tsar, do what he wanted them to do, that he could manipulate them. And the fact that the people thought that Rasputin was having an affair with Alexandra. And he wanted Nicholas to believe him, to say, look, here's the evidence, this man has got to go. Nicholas saw the information and he knew it was true. But when he showed it to Alexandra, she claimed it was all lies and that he was being persecuted because he was a saint, and all saints are persecuted.
Not long after, Stolypin was murdered, shot in the Kiev Opera Theatre whilst attending a royal function with the Tsar. With his #1 enemy out of the way, Rasputin's corrupt influence on government was becoming increasingly evident.
We had 4 prime ministers, I think 5 ministers of the interior, 4 ministers of agriculture, 3 ministers of war.
Instability was seeping through the slack reins of government and onto the city streets. The St. Petersburg papers were bursting with letters from rape victims, crude cartoons, and articles rich with scandalous allegations.
There's a rumour mill which is taking over, and Rasputin is at the centre of all this. And there were all sorts of companies producing postcards, stamps, souvenirs. There's one which is a picture of Rasputin standing behind the Empress with one of her breasts in his hand. And it says simply, "Samoderzhavie," the Russian word for autocracy. So his holding of her breast was a symbol of the autocracy, which was his hold on the whole Russian state.
With the very framework of Russian society in disarray, Russia went to war with Germany.
Brotherhood and freedom. You're what splendid words. Justice, equality, and bread. Don't you think they're splendid?
Yes, I do.
Brotherhood and freedom.
Brotherhood and fiddlesticks. You're frozen through. You've no right, Anushka. It isn't fair.
doubt they'll sing in tune after the revolution.
One. The war would become a calamity of unparalleled magnitude for Russia. But in its first heady weeks, a wave of patriotism swept the nation. The Tsar's dwindling popularity was restored.
Bourgeois terms, it was a war between the Allies and Germany. In Bolshevik terms, it was a war between the Allied and German upper classes, and which of them won was a matter of indifference.
Papers were filling up with the names of dead soldiers.
Russia is at war. It's going very badly.
Far from Moscow and St. Petersburg, the Russian army, badly organized and under-equipped, was floundering. 30,000 men were killed, 90,000 captured in a single engagement. Increasingly, Russia's cities were plagued by shortages of food and clothing, and Rasputin was identified with all of the government's faults and failures. By using Rasputin as the focus of their attack, even revolutionaries could criticize the Tsar in ways the general public could accept.
The misery of the people grows, deepens, becomes more and more acute. A natural result of the war, multiplied by the criminal anarchy of Rasputin Tsarism. Leon Trotsky.
At the front, the carnage continued. In battles fought in the spring and summer of 1915, nearly 1.5 million Russian soldiers lost their lives. The ocean of tears, the slaughter, and the grief Rasputin had foreseen in his terrifying vision was now reality. In the summer of 1915, 1 year into the First World War, Rasputin was about to be thrust into a position of real power for the first time. Until then, his role, though vital, was almost entirely limited to protecting the health of Alexei. This had earned him the gratitude of Tsar Nicholas, but the Tsarina Alexandra revered her holy healer. Soon, she would be able to grant Rasputin a new pivotal importance.
Her relationship with Rasputin was not matter-of-fact and businesslike. She thought God was speaking to the family through Rasputin, and when he said something, she took it seriously.
And the Tsar, in what was to be a fatal error, decides to take over the command of the army, leaves the capital, goes off to the front.
And he leaves Alexandra in charge of the government. She is to watch over the ministries. That was her job. But she doesn't do this alone. She calls in Rasputin as her advisor. And from this period on, this is when he's at his height of his powers.
Once established at his new headquarters far from St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas devoted his attention to military operations. Increasingly, when making decisions about how the country was to be ruled, he relied on Alexandra's opinions and reports, and Alexandra depended on Rasputin. The constant stream of letters and telegrams she sent from the palace to the front were filled with references to the man she called our friend.
The most discouraging example of the influence of Rasputin concerns the last minister of the Interior, Protopopov. Protopopov was absolutely incompetent. It's a very sad story for those of us who love the royal family.
Rasputin begs you earnestly to keep Protopopov there. I think you could not do better. Obey your firm little wife and our friend. Believe in us, Alexandra.
The incompetent and widely hated minister remained in office, a decision which seemed to confirm the importance of Rasputin's opinions. In fact, Rasputin may have only been echoing and supporting decisions Alexandra had already made.
His role in the palace was to understand Alexandra's wishes and voice them. You can really trust me on this one. Had his desires differed, even for a second, Rasputin would be finished. He knew the boundaries of the game he was playing.
She just put her faith and trust in this Rasputin, and anything he said went.
Rasputin's influence was spreading all the way to the front line, with devastating consequences.
Nicholas, as the commander-in-chief of the army from 1915, was obliged to take the advice of his senior commanders, and they were very aware of Rasputin's malevolent influence.
And in letter after letter to the Tsar, we see this pleading, this nagging, this begging. You must do as this man says, or Russia will go under, it will lose the throne. Our child will never sit on the throne unless you listen to what Rasputin says. And poor Nicholas, knowing what Rasputin was, trying to ignore her, trying to put this to the side, trying not to answer her, but she is determined. And eventually he gives in almost on everything.
By replacing the war minister with Vladimir Sukhomlinov, a money-grabbing, incompetent and close friend, Rasputin signed the death warrants of millions of Russian soldiers.
It was a disaster. You had soldiers without rifles, or you had rifles without bullets. In certain circumstances, they had bullets and rifles, but one didn't go with the other. And soldiers were in summer uniform, and winter was coming, and you had people freezing to death. They were basically engaging in a 19th century war against a 20th century enemy. They were being slaughtered on the battlefields, absolutely slaughtered.
Millions of Russian soldiers were marching towards certain death. As the trenches were filling up with untrained teenagers, generals were taking their own lives.
In 1915, the war turns dramatically for the worse. The German machine of metal breaks through the Russian infantry and forces them into a retreat.
As Mother Russia mourned her loss, people were beginning to demand some answers. All fingers were pointing to Rasputin.
Soldiers' letters back from the front all suggest that they explained the defeat of the army in 1915 as not just the incompetence of the government, but as active treason within it. Rumours were beginning to circulate that there was a pro-German bloc giving the German commanders secrets about military manoeuvres, in which Rasputin and the Empress were the main culprits.
Palace authorities tried to dampen the stories. Rasputin kept the fire alight by spreading wild rumors about his passionate nights with the Empress.
There was one very famous occasion in the restaurant of the Yard where in 1915 he took a few prostitutes and began to get drunk and to play with the gypsy ladies, and he made these gestures with his hands saying, "Oh yes, I can make the Empress dance to any way I fashion."
Rasputin once ran out on the balcony, waved his private parts to crowds beneath, shouting, "This is what rules Russia."
What counts is not whether the rumors are true or not. It's the ability of these rumors to spread, enter people's mind as if they were truth.
Rasputin had become a living legend, whose own judgment day was drawing near.
Rasputin is demonized. The monarchists blame him for bringing the monarchy down. The people who are opposed to his influence over the monarchy, members of the inner circle of the Romanov family, who see his influence as disastrous, the senior police, senior members of the government, When all of these people decide enough of Rasputin, then I think the final story is already scripted.
In the small hours of a cold December night in 1916, Rasputin was driven to the palace of the Tsar's cousin, Prince Yusupov, for what he thought was a secret tryst with a beautiful woman.
When he turned up in his shiny silk shirt, best leather boots, ready to meet this beautiful hostess, he was invited down into the basement and given poisoned Madeira. It didn't seem to have any effect on him. He was given some cakes which had cyanide. Again, the guy seemed to be as robust as ever. At this point, Yusupov becomes impatient, goes to his office, collects a pistol, comes down again, shoots Rasputin twice in the side. Rasputin falls to the ground. They believe he's dead, and the conspirators take away his coat. In their absence, he gets up again, staggers out of the doorway into the courtyard, where he's found and shot again.
They begin to think that he's actually the devil incarnate, and they can't get rid of him.
Yusupov's frustration was so great that he allegedly castrated the man he referred to as Satan.
They start beating him with a rubber truncheon and kicking him. They finally get him into a car.
They then drive him away and dump him in the river, where he's washed up a couple of days later.
Grigory Rasputin was finally dead. Within 3 months of his murder, the Tsar lost his throne, and the royal family were imprisoned and later executed.
If there wasn't a Rasputin, they probably wouldn't have fallen so fast as they had, and so disastrously. They were really hated, and hated most probably because of Rasputin's involvement with them.
The revolutionaries see him as the embodiment of everything that was evil about the old regime. And they use his image to frighten the people, so that if they betray the revolution, they will get Rasputin, they will get the Germans coming back, everything evil will return.
Rasputin's body was later exhumed and burnt by the revolutionaries as a symbol of the complete annihilation of Russian imperial government.
In death, Rasputin was nearly as potent a symbol as he had been in life. Many believed a spell had been lifted with his murder, a curse which had doomed the country to defeat and destruction. Now there was hope. Even Tsar Nicholas seemed to receive the news with little sorrow, as though relieved to be rid of the controversial holy man. Alexandra was depressed and downcast, but within a month she recovered. Russia was at war. Russia and her family needed her. Young Alexei would have to survive his bouts of hemophilia without his beloved healer. Ironically, it would be revolution and not illness which would finally claim his life. It was a revolution Rasputin had foreseen. Shortly before his death, he had written Tsar Nicholas a chilling and strangely specific prophecy.
If I'm killed by my brothers, the Russian peasants, you have nothing to fear. If it is your relations who have brought about my death, then none of your family will remain alive for more than 2 years. They will all be killed by the Russian people. Grigory Rasputin.
3 months after Rasputin's prophecy, a St. Petersburg bread riot triggered the Russian Revolution. "15 months after that, Nicholas and Alexandra and all their children were shot, bayoneted, and beaten to death. Rasputin's final prediction had been fulfilled. Even though he was in his grave, there was to be a final macabre scene in Rasputin's story, as he too fell victim to the revolution's fury. Soldiers of the Revolutionary Army tore his body from its final resting place and burned it to ashes. Rasputin had been a man of immense personal magnetism, blessed with undeniable gifts of prophecy and healing. But he was also deeply flawed. He would be immortalized in legend as the very embodiment of evil, a satanic master. In the end, however, he was only a man swept away by the force of history.
Rasputin! Cool mustache, Wario. Try messing with the man monk, you'll be sorry. Oh, how many dictators does it take to turn an empire into a union to ruin the states? It's a disgrace what you did to your own people. Your daddy beat you like a dog and now you're evil. You're from Georgia, sweet Georgia, and history books unfold ya as a messed up motherfucker bit in the mind. You're a superpower, but it paid the price with the endless destruction of Russian lies. You're a man of steel, I spit kryptonite. Big dick mystic, known to hypnotize. I can end you with a whisper to your eyes. Look into my eyes, you perverted witch. See the soul of the man who made Mother Russia his bitch. You think I give a fuck about my wife? My own son got locked up in prison, and I didn't save his life. You get off easy when they pickle that moose cock. I'd leave your neck in a noose in a trench and shot. Your whole family shot. All your wizard friends shot. Anyone who sold you pierogi shot. Starving for days so you waste away. I even crushed motherfuckers when I'm laying in state. I'd have let it took Trotsky out of the picture. Dropped the hammer on you harder than I bitch slapped Hitler. I have no pride for you who ruined everything my revolution was doing to stop the bourgeoisie. I fought the bondage of classes, the proletariat masses that brought me here to spit a thesis against both of your asses. Let me start with you there, Frankenstein, looking like something out of R.L. Stein. It's hip-hop chowder, red of a wine. This is odds why I can't do shit tonight. And Joseph, you were supposed to be my right-hand man, but your loyalty shriveled up like your right-hand man. My whole future was bright. You let your heart grow dark and stop the greatest revolution since the birth of Marx.
Knock, 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 knock. Did somebody say Bert Marx?
Yo, I'm the host with the most glass nose. Assholes made a mess and the war got cold. Shook hands with both Ronalds, Reagan and McDonald's, no doubt. If your name ends with in, time to get out. I have the balls to let Baryshnikov dance, player. Go down that wall like the Kool-Aid man. Oh yeah! You two need yoga. You need a shower. And you all need to learn how to handle real power.
Did somebody say real power? Da, you want to mess with me? I spit hard bars when I'm crushing these beats. Blow it up like a tuba while I'm balling in Cuba, doing judo moves and schooling every communist suka. I'm a president, my prime, my enemy don't distract me. The last man who attacked